Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Greetings and welcome to All Things Policy podcast of the Takshashila Institution. Today, I'm joined by Ashwin, who is a staff research analyst with the Advanced Military Technologies and Outer Space program of the Takshashila Institution. I'm your host for today. I'm Abhishek, and I study the US domestic politics with Takshashila Institution's Geostrategy program. Welcome, everyone, and welcome Ashwin to our program.
Thanks, Abhishek. Great to be here.
So, wars in our imaginations are fought with hardwares that governments own, right? Like tanks, jets, warships. But today we are talking something different, maybe the role of private and commercial assets in war. So, Ashwin, before we delve into today's topic of commercial systems in military conflicts, it will be very helpful if you could set the stage for our audience. Why do modern militaries need commercial companies at all?
Great question, Abhishek. This is a very interesting phenomenon that we are seeing unfold before our eyes as we see all these wars occurring at different parts of the world. Many people refer to the Russia-Ukraine war as the first commercial space war. And I'd like to use space as the case study here because there are a lot of overt implications that are very fascinating to unpack. It's called the first commercial space war because since this war and even in the Iran war that is still going on and has been the active point of conversation for a lot of us, the amount of dependence or the sheer scale of use of private assets that was very, very essential to the fighting of the war is a very new thing. I mean, you had this happen on some level at various instances. When it's a war, countries will use whatever they can to fight it and gain an advantage. But the essentiality of how much of this private sector resources was involved in this war, especially in the realm of space technology, was striking. And so that has then led many governments, especially the US government, to actually articulate how it would like to institutionalize this going forward. The basic reason why these countries need private companies is simply because today wars have become very, very technological. Like military modernization is basically becoming more tech forward, and in that process a lot of the technology they need is better made by private companies rather than the government itself, simply because the costs are prohibitive. You need these as always available sort of a system. But what would the government do with that system when it is not fighting wars? During peacetime, they would just lie dormant, and they're still very essential for when there is a conflict or during wartime. So the best way for economically sustaining such infrastructure and for the military to have that advantage is have this capacity in the private sector that sells that capacity to the government, to the non-war fighting parts of the government for local use, for the local population in the country, for their own commercial use, and for the rest of the world as an export of sorts. And that the revenue that it generates, the commercial activity itself will sustain that capability during peacetime. Then during wartime, some of it can be provisioned for the purposes of the war. And obviously this has a lot of this is like an amazing onion that we can unpack layer by layer slowly over the course of this conversation. But that's the idea that led the US government to kind of institutionalize this, and the way they have done it is through this framework called the Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve Framework. You can think of it like the reserve army in India, or any of the reserve forces that countries keep, militaries keep for just in case they are needed. And they are doing the same thing for this. And the way it would work is that a private company under the CASR framework on the list would have to agree to commit a certain part of its capacity, which will then be given to the government during wartime, and the government would use it. Otherwise, which will be free for the company to use based on its own, like purposes. And there will be a lot of strings attached to this. I mean, in terms of how the government can dictate this be used during war and all of that. But that's basically a contract that the government tries to have. So that's the idea about this whole technology and how it's become so.
So you had mentioned about commercial augmentation spaces, right? It sounds more like a mercenary kind of framework if we go back to ancient Rome or something, I guess. So what exactly is this? Where does this idea come from? Could you elaborate about?
Yeah, that's a fascinating way of looking at it, and in a way, it is true, and it gets seen as a mercenary network, a military asset rather than a private one for many intents and purposes. The idea came from, I think, especially in the context of the space reserve, the idea most likely came from the Berlin airlift that occurred back in 1949, which then led the government to create the CRAF, which is basically an airlift service that the Department of Defense would need. Suppose there is an emergency, suppose there is a large amount of people and resources need to be evacuated from a certain place. The capacity of the military flights that the US had at its disposal would probably not be enough to do it suddenly and within time. And in which case, the US wanted a provision where it could use commercial airliners and their aircraft to be deployed rapidly, and they can go and airlift people and from sensitive spots. So obviously, these sensitive spots would perhaps be war torn. It can also be something that is of a calamity of sorts, but not necessarily with an adversarial tension. But even if not, even if in most cases it is because of war-torn regions and conflict. For instance, it was invoked during the Gulf Wars in 1990-91. So in such cases, these commercial airlines are basically acting as military assets. They fly in, they take people out of these places, and they bring them back to safety. So as soon as this is invoked, this is activated, suddenly the military has commercial assets under its disposal. And this plays out at various instances. I mean, during the Battle of Dunkirk in the World War, the English Channel, a lot of soldiers were rescued on commercial boats. So, but those were not institutionalized. This is institutionalized, and it's happening on a massive scale. And there is a solid contract. And that also overtly has some implications on how this company will be perceived. Like they will know that this company is going to become a military asset for the country when the time comes. So I guess the idea came from there. And obviously, there are various instances of this happening in the course of history in terms of mercenary forces or civilian forces that were trained to become, become potent as a military force when the time arose. And most of those has been in the context of army or human personnel that can fight wars. But now we are seeing it happen with technology. Which is very interesting. And obviously, I mean, there are differences in how it will happen for a space reserve compared to an airlifting facility. But yeah, that's something we can perhaps get into.
So if we zoom out a bit and look at the relationship between these private companies and the state as a whole, right? Before say 2020 or up until even very recently also, we had this discussion about how, when the role of private companies increases, the role of the state has been decreasing. But ever since the AI issue has emerged as a state issue, we have seen how companies are controlling more and more the private entities, and these partners obviously for all of their utility are being pressurized by the government, or there is that kind of relationship between them, right? So do you think this will also extend to the space sector as well with this kind of an agreement?
Absolutely. It's a I think the world we live in today is, it's a world that is deglobalizing, right? Like the lines on the borders are firming up. It's more about indigenous capacity and sovereign capability and all of that. In such a context, I think the companies that are inherently multinational will still start to have some leaning towards their home base, and the lines between corporations and countries blur, and you will not know whether the action of a certain entity is because of the government acting, or is it the company acting in its own capacity. Take Starlink for instance. During the conflict in Iran and before, right, like when the protests broke out and the communication blackout happened, the internet was shut down and all of that, Starlink immediately came out and said provision Starlink services across the country for free, which then the protesters found as a lifeline to keep the moment going. Now, if you were to answer that question as an analyst, could you pinpoint and say, no, it was Starlink acting as a commercial entity, supporting free speech and all of the other reasons they stated for doing so? Obviously, the announcement came from Elon Musk. So, is it a private company doing this, or is it the US government asking them to do it, and therefore also enjoying the ambiguity of acting through a commercial player? It does not have to, the US government doesn't have to come out and do this on its own. So you can't really pinpoint where these decisions are coming from. Same thing in the Russia-Ukraine war. The amount of communications and like military operations that were carried out on the satellite internet service provided by the US, you can't really pinpoint and say the US military provided this and ask the private company to do it, or the private company did it on its own, simply as a taking on the responsibility of its own. So the lines between these two things become very, very blurry, and these will have implications further on about how the company is perceived or how the country is perceived, and how that will fare for all the foreign customers that these companies will have.
Yes. So clearly, by what you're saying, the private companies are also taking a major amount of risk here, right? So in that context, do you think it is a good deal for both sides in terms of what they are gaining and what they're giving?
Yeah, it is at least in the context of this space reserve, there are so many benefits and disadvantages to both sides that it is like a very fascinating thing to discuss. I mean, take the benefits, for instance. What does this do for the military? The military gets access to on-demand, like on-call capability for technology that it will always need but cannot actually have on hand. Or maybe it is building this over time, but until it does, it needs this, and this is a way for them to quickly get it. And for the companies, this is a great way for them to have an anchor customer that constantly pays them. Obviously, when this contract is on, the government will pay them for provisioning this capacity and keeping it alive. And so there is that price risk built into that transaction, and therefore they have an anchor customer. And it's also a very strong signal for the companies to send that, look, we are providing military grade service to like our country's armed forces. And so that itself becomes a bragging right of sorts that has its own like implications on funding, and it'll also raise this company's reputation around the world. And perhaps the companies that sell to the US military will also have US allied countries interested in buying this service from them, and so that gives them a sense of legitimacy for sure. But there are disadvantages, which is where we have to observe this phenomenon as it unfolds and see how both parties deal with it. For example, the disadvantage for the military, which also applies to the companies, is that some things about the commercial nature of these space assets like satellites is what makes them attractive to the military as a space reserve. The fact that they enjoy the ambiguity of being under the control of a private company but may act on the orders of the US military when the need arises, or the fact that they are seen as a commercial asset and not a military asset, and so therefore are less likely to be targeted during war. And those things start to change when this becomes an institutional framework. Now, if the CASR list is public, that every single one of those satellites that are under CASR will instantly be perceived as a military target by adversaries when a war breaks out. If it is not public, which is even worse for the like, it's great for the like national sensitivity and security of the country, but then perhaps every single US satellite, even though they are commercially owned, might be targeted as a military asset by the adversaries. And so that's a like, suppose you are a private company that is not on the CASR list, but your satellites are still under threat because of all of this, then you will obviously be accepting a level of risk that is not even like, no one is incentivizing you to accept that risk. And that's a problem, that the economic problem that the US government has to work out. And that will, for the companies, have its own implications, like, will the insurance be higher? Or like, because they are now selling to the US military, will, let's say, countries in the West Asian region, or maybe India, does not want to buy from corporations that are on the CASR list because they don't want anything to do with because these contracts might come with more coercive measures, like the US government might have a denial of service order that says if they want, they can ask a private company to not provide service in certain parts of the world, even if that contract is not there. What if when the CASR clauses are invoked, a service being provided at a deep level in the Indian commercial sector, with which a lot of economic implications are intertwined, gets pulled off, like like basically the rug gets pulled out of from under our legs because it's now going to the military. And so where will that leave us? And considering how long some of these wars can draw out, what are the long-term implications? Those are all questions that will have a commercial impact on the company and a military impact on the like the state. And so we don't know whether having the CASR tag is going to become exceedingly important for companies, or also might even become undesirable if the events of the world go that way. And like, the first strike capability of a lot of wars are always commercial, like enterprises, because even if you think back to the World War, the day one of August 1914, one of the first things the British government did in the course of the war was to cut all the German subsea cables. And so that's easy because, one, you're disrupting a massive strategic commercial infrastructure that the country depends on even for its war, and no lives are being lost. So it's it won't generate a huge outcry in terms of human rights and human lives, but it will still impact the war and the economy in a big way. That's going to become true for satellites also. Satellites are easy to target, and there's no loss of life. There's a famous quote by a US general that said, satellites do not have mothers. So you will see this play out. And also, like, take a commercial airliner, for instance, or maybe ships that are acting on military order, commercial ships. There is an escalation ladder, there's a coercion ladder that adversaries can use against this, right? Like, if there's a commercial ship, you can go and you can search it, you can seize it, you can stop it, you can interdict, right? And in the case of aircraft, you can send your own fighters and force the aircraft to land in your borders and do all of that in the case of CRAF. But what will you do with a space reserve? It's all very binary. You either attack or you don't, because there is no coercion ladder. You'll have to either dazzle them or take cyber attacks and all of that. So it's not as straightforward and not as clean cut as it is for other assets, where assets are actually on the ground, they get activated and then they fly. Here, these assets are always in operation. So perhaps even during peacetime, they start getting targeted by the Russians and the Chinese, because the US satellites are flying over China and Russia every day. So yeah, these are all risks that they'll have to address.
So, a quick segue into the key point about how it is for governments a low stakes, high reward kind of situation, right? If you look at it from a company's perspective, won't it be of deterrent value for companies to publicly align openly with with the state as such, with their assets being exposed? Because as you rightly said, satellites don't have mothers, but they definitely have companies backing them who treat them like babies, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, so two questions here. First is, will this deter more and more companies from collaborating with the US government or operating within or being recognized as a US based company? Will that happen, as we see in case of something as minute as taxes or those kind of things which force them to move offshore, right? That is one point. Second is, when we look at companies collaborating with the US government, as I had mentioned previously, in terms of the deterrent value again. So first is the offshore element in that sense. Second is, do you think this strategy could have been taken, could be viewed as a more of a clandestine kind of thing rather than a public policy strategy, right? Because if it were more clandestine, more companies would be incentivized in being part of this partnership, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
That's very interesting, and it might as well become true based on the terms of the contract and how this plays out. Perhaps for some companies, being viewed as a military asset is a big plus. I mean, considering the few contracts that CASR has already signed with companies, they are all SDA contracts, like space domain awareness contracts, where the only thing being exchanged hands is not like actual physical satellites, but rather the data, and it's a very safe thing for them to sell. They're just selling to the US Army in terms of the data that they have as a part of their commercial operations. And they have, like there's like a 1.1 million contract that has been signed over the last 3 months or so, in the last year, to service these space reserve mechanisms. So in that case, perhaps it's desirable, right? Because they have nothing to lose. They gain the tag, they gain recognition, maybe they gain some access, they gain relationships within the US administration, and it gives them chance to get more funding and all of that. But the moment you have this extending to a company like Starlink, which has real satellites like flying around in the sky and has customers across, like 150 countries, over 10 million of them, I believe, and all of them using this as a commercial service, and that then needing, that having a military connotation means they have other issues to deal with. Maybe they deal with it and it's fine, maybe it's not. And there's a reason why I think the CASR has not been signed with SATCOM yet, satellite communications, despite needing a lot of that. Like there's a lot of demand for it. Maybe they're still working this out, but it's worth observing from at least the Indian perspective what will happen and where. And the other question about doing these things clandestinely, that's a that's a enforcement problem. What if the US government has just handshake agreements with these companies to carry out its orders during wartime, and because there are no contracts that can be enforced by US courts if there is a breach of agreement and all of that, if because of that the companies refuse to follow orders, this is obviously reported but no confirmed statements as such. But during Ukraine's operations in Crimea, there is a lot of reports that say Starlink refused to provide connection. And it is still unclear whether the US government wanted them to stop the connection there during the operation, or if it was Elon Musk's decision. And so perhaps CASR might be an institutional framework to prevent this sort of discretion to private companies to take their own decisions in the context of these very sensitive and very critical operations, if that was the case. So yeah, in a way, it is also just like the government, the state, making sure enforcement is complete if they need it to be.
Right. So, because you mentioned India's context as well, and treat this as the concluding question, I guess. So, since this involves American companies, takes place in America, what does it mean for India and the rest of the world, especially in the context that throughout the last year and earlier this year as well, U.S. Congress has been active in passing legislation for bringing greater, India-U.S. cooperation in the space sector, especially involving private partnerships and that kind of thing. So, in that context, what are India's interests here?
Yeah, this basically means that countries are treating commercial satellites as a new kind of arsenal. Just as you had a nuclear arsenal and a non-nuclear ordnance arsenal, you literally have a new arsenal of commercial satellites that countries will use when there is war. And so that means, like typically arsenals and arms trigger a race, right? And so this is on one hand going to trigger an arms race, but not of arms, but of satellites, and specifically commercial satellites around the world. Everyone will want to have a commercial satellite arsenal of their own. And so India will obviously respond to that in its own way. And we see this playing out already. The Chinese have started to launch more than they ever did before. Indians are trying to, like develop their local industry so as to, like increase their activities in space and like occupy a larger share of the space economy or globally, and like incentivize an entire ecosystem to participate more actively. And so if you want to see this happen over time, and that means it's literally a race and India has to run it whether it likes to or not. Second is it'll start to become the sovereign nature of technology will start to get some importance, because let's say Starlink is the most beneficial technology for Indian military to use on a level which is not critical but still helps with logistics, helps during peacetime and all of that. Can they trust, if Starlink becomes a part of CASR, can they trust this technology and know that it will not be denied during some critical India-China operations that is occurring, and the US simply invokes CASR and pulls out a lot of Starlink capacity for itself? That's a question, and that will mean India will want to have a baseline level of its own capability in all respects, which is again the deglobalization playing out on some level. This needn't just be the military, right? It even might be the commercial operations. We might need it for our own digital economy, and then having that dependence that might just stop everything in its tracks itself is a scary prospect. And perhaps India will start looking at only buying from not CASR companies. Whether that will happen is will be interesting to see, but perhaps there will be US companies that specifically brand themselves as not CASR and they want to sell to countries in the West Asian region and India and all of that. That will be also something to watch out for. But ultimately, this means that it's becoming a zero-sum game or a negative-sum game of sorts, the entire global space industry, including especially the commercial industry. And that's something that we'll have to factor into in our policy, in our budgets, in our like plans, contracts, procurement decisions, and military timelines.
Thank you for that, Ashwin. With this, we come to an end to this podcast. And if you're more really interested in space power and the broader implications of the growing space sector in the strategic sense for countries, do check out Ashwin's expert capsule course, the space power course, of whom I have been a proud alumni of. And definitely join in for the next episode of All Things Policy Podcast. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thanks, Abhishek. This was a delight.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.